Welcome back to IR in Focus, the show where we dive into the latest trends, strategies, and economics shaping investor relations. I'm your host, Carmen Lilly, and in the next 20 minutes, we will be unpacking 2024 economic trends with a focus on labor markets and policy, and taking a look forward to 2025. With me on this discussion is economist Kathryn Edwards. Kathryn Ann Edwards is a PhD economist, independent economic policy consultant, and Bloomberg columnist. Her research focuses on the intersection of labor markets and public policy, including unemployment and unemployment insurance, recessions and recoveries, women's labor supply, poverty alleviation, retirement security, and Social Security. She previously served as an economist at Rand and a professor at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. She received her PhD from Wisconsin. Welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad to have you on the podcast today as our special guest. And we're definitely going to be, taking a deeper dive into your sweet spot, labor and policy markets. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit on more broadly how you felt 2024 went.
For the economy?
For the economy.
For the economy. How did 2024 go? This period of the economy that we're in, not necessarily limited to just this calendar year, but certainly in this time period, one of the most interesting economic time periods in U.S. history. To see such high inflation spike and then come down in a controlled way without seeing a massive rise in unemployment, without tipping the economy into recession, this is miraculous in every sense of the word, except for how Americans experienced it, because an economy on the precipice is still not the best one to be in. What will strike me about this year is just how far apart the American experience on the ground moved from the American experience 10,000 feet up, looking down, grateful that we haven't tipped into a recession, but looking up so mad with how hard it is to thrive in the economy.
Yeah, and I think I've definitely seen that sentiment as well. I'm looking at specifically like the stock markets or the equity markets and what those are doing. And we read these stories about all-time highs. Then you think about like the average Joe experience. There does seem to be a large disconnect there.
Yeah, so an example to bring that into focus would be to say, look at the unemployment rate for the past 3 years. We came out of the single worst month of job loss the U.S. has, and I'm going to guess probably will ever seen at the start of the pandemic. I mean, 22.5 million jobs deleted from the economy in less than 4 weeks. It was absolutely catastrophic. And yet within 2 years, the unemployment rate had fallen enough that we were starting to see unemployment rate below 4%, and it's maintained that, full employment average of just very low unemployment rates for 2 years now. But at the same time, hiring cratered right as the Fed started to raise interest rates. And even though unemployment didn't tick up and layoffs didn't tick up, hiring fell. And so you have this disjoint between a macroeconomic trend that is telling you good things versus this kind of experience you would have if you were looking for a job right now. And if you were looking for a job right now, the hiring rate is at levels we typically see in peak recessions. But everything else in the economy is kind of humming along, as we judge it by the unemployment rate. And those are the types of disconnects you see all over this economy. And I think it's partly a function of what a special place we're in, bringing down interest rates without causing a recession. At least not yet.
Mm-hmm. Honing in on the labor market trends and thinking about 2024, can you speak a little bit more to that? I think your comments in general have been pulling in like since COVID, but honing in on 2024, what sort of observations or trends were you seeing there?
2024 in particular was, I think will be just the year that interest rates started to fall. I think 2024 in particular would be the year that wages started to outpace inflation, but also the year that hiring didn't pick up. As the Fed raised interest rates, there was this question of when will they have done enough to bring them back down? And are we going to have to go far enough to cause a recession? Well, over this summer, 2024 was really a turning point in a lot of the indicators to say inflation is brought under control. We need to bring down interest rates. And the Fed certainly moved to do that in the fall. But in the meantime, I think you're starting to see inflation fall and wages rise, but when they cross each other, right? When the monthly wage increases versus monthly inflation increases, when wages start to outpace, that doesn't mean they've caught up to the price growth that's taken place in the interim. And so I think for me, 2024 is just this like wonderfully contradictory year in so many ways that, you could tell people wage growth has been beating price growth and they'll look at you like you're crazy. Even those things are true. So I guess 2024 is, I'm not sure if there's a pithy word to describe other than full of contradictions. Prices came down, interest rates came down, wages started to outpace prices, but none of those things felt certain. None of those things felt like it was actually accomplished. I mean, we're still following CPI. Today is the 12th. We're still closely following PPI. It's not like the idea of price growth is in the rear view by any means. It's still very closely followed.
Yeah, and speaking of that, so we just got the November numbers, right? We're recording here on the 12th. And to note, the PPI rose 0.4% from the previous month. So again, this is November's numbers. And that did exceed market expectations. I think we were expecting around a 0.2% increase. So when we look at this, just tying this back to the disconnect, and then looking at PPI, so food prices, they rose significantly. And then also looking at energy. So energy and food, they rose 0.2% from the previous month, which to your point may be causing some of the pain and disconnect when we look at these larger economic indicators versus, the consumer experience.
I would just stress that, we don't have it all figured out yet. And I think that this economy of 2024 is raising a lot more questions than it answers as to how and why things are happening the way that they are.
And it's funny because, when COVID happened and we're all trying to move through the post-COVID recovery, we tend to use the term unprecedented times a lot, right? To the point where we're all like, unprecedented times is like the new normal. But I think what you're saying is that like what we're seeing in terms of numbers and indicators, we're still in a very, very unusual spot.
Yes, we absolutely are. And it's helpful to remember that at the end of 2020, even through 2023, there were still incredible predictions that we will absolutely fall into recession within 12 calendar months. You have investment banks that are doing their own research predictions, and like slowly you start to see people stop predicting a recession. And there wasn't one thing that happened. There wasn't just one data point or one moment. It was just a very slow confluence of events that has then convinced people that maybe actually we aren't going to tip into a recession. There's just not many points in US history where that has been the case, where we have somehow seen a recession coming and been able to move around it and get out of the way. So even that is special. But I will say, like, maybe it's just the same unprecedented time that if you like the pandemic, the pandemic recession was 2.5 months long. The recovery was about 2 years long, but that doesn't mean that unprecedented time has gone away or stopped influencing our lives today just because the most acute period is over. I mean, I think in some ways this is the pandemic's interest rate and inflation story. And we don't have necessarily the tools to understand it because it's been so special, even though that I empathize with like ready to not be special anymore. Right. Ready to be just very boring.
Exactly. You made an interesting comment at the beginning. You're talking about wage increases, right? So going back to that point, so when I'm looking at the numbers here, so we still have federal minimum wage at $7.25. I know some states, like in California, they had minimum wage increases this year. And then when looking forward in 2025, we have more than, I think it's around 20 states increasing their minimum wage in 2025. So with that in mind, can you just expand a little bit more on wages in general in 2024? What do you expect in 2025? And how will those wage increases really impact the labor markets?
There are two things that determine how much a person's wage grows. It's a function of both their skill, their value added to the company, and their power, how much they're able to make sure that they are compensated for that power. The productivity part, I think, is pretty straightforward. It depends on your age, your education, your experience, your specific skills, how long you've worked at the company, how valuable the company is, and those are very much a translation of skills to dollars. The power part is much trickier because power varies across the labor market, it varies within the labor market, it varies over time. And one of the biggest factors that influences power is the outside option. If your employer isn't willing to match your wage, the wage that you want, can you go somewhere else? Well, when the unemployment rate is 9%, they kind of know you don't have anywhere to go. And when the unemployment rate is 4%, they, they know that you might have outside options on the table. And this was a massive accelerant of wage growth when we had, I don't know if y'all remember quiet quitting or the great resignation, the great switch, whatever we called this kind of period of intense labor market movement in 2022 and 2021, that people were moving on to new jobs. That's associated with wage growth because people they're asserting their power in the labor market. In 2024, the unemployment rate stayed low, but hiring didn't pick up to the same degree. So we saw wage growth. It was starting to beat inflation on the month over month and year over year level. The real question for wages of 2025 is which way will the scales tip in terms of power between worker and employer? You see evidence going in both directions. So, the strikes that we've seen over the past year, from pretty big and notable employers, we've seen some massive labor contracts for new union contracts where strikes were avoided. That would suggest that we're in this kind of era of worker power. But at the same time, you have this kind of bottom of the labor market, people who aren't unionized, people who are in low wage shift sectors, who some of them live in labor markets in which the minimum is brought up. And I think they all come to play for any specific worker or wage trend.
And then taking that a little bit a step further here, that was very insightful, though. Thank you. Thinking about this shift in dynamics, and then you mentioned a little bit about unionizing and labor going on strike. To me, that kind of harkens back to the United Auto Workers strike. But are there other sectors that may feel more pressure here when it comes to thinking about worker power and wages?
I think that depends on policy going forward. The Biden administration championed an LRB, National Labor Relations Board, that had a lot of teeth and was very much enforcing the right of workers to unionize. The incoming Trump administration has said a lot of things, one of which is that they would walk back this power and that they would change who is on the NLRB and what their mandate is, essentially tipping the scale away from unionization. The NLRB matters most for new sectors and new shops that would like to organize but haven't already. And the NLRB is not the decision maker. They just make sure everyone's following the rules. And I do not hold much hope that the Trump administration's NLRB is going to make sure that businesses are following the rules. So I think for people who are already established in unions, they are trying to consolidate power to get the best for their members. But for people who would like to unionize, they're losing a champion. And I don't think that champion will be replaced. I mean, Starbucks was one that was a really interesting case to follow because it saw some of the most rapid support for unionization among its ranks, with some of the most severe repercussions from management for those workers. And we're in a very interesting time I'm not going to say unprecedented. I'm not going to say unprecedented, but we are in an interesting time for the US economy, for wages and income and inequality, because we have so many policies that we know accomplish very good things that we almost summarily refuse to execute. We know, for example, that if you had a mandate for paid sick leave, that every worker in the US has to have some nominal amount of sick days, which, 40% of workers in the service sector, like the low wage retail trade, 40% of them don't have a paid sick day. Not because they don't get sick, mind you, but because they could actually still be fired for not showing up to a shift while sick, and they wouldn't be paid if they missed it. Well, you enact paid sick days, and you have higher retention, you have higher earnings, you have, especially for women with young children children get 5 to 6 colds a year before they turn 5. Those women see some of the biggest gains from being able to be paid to stay home with their sick child. There's so much evidence about how, not only just how helpful paid sick days are to the labor market, to workers, to retention, but just how little it costs employers. And yet, almost any change to the status quo is being fought with the most vicious ferocity of, like, you cannot make me pay sick days to my workers. It doesn't matter how good it is across the board. People, you'll have the Chamber of Commerce say that we absolutely can't do this. Those policies of, this is very good for the economy, this is very good for family income, this shifts the balance of income inequality, it just feels like those are starting to mount. And there's a real question I have for the economy, maybe not just in 2025, but for the next 10 years, of how long do policymakers want to put their fingers in their ear and yell out, no, 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 because they don't want to hear that paid family leave helps workers up and down the wage distribution, up and down the income distribution, across industries, across sectors.
Yeah, and so maybe tying that back to your earlier comment, thinking about 2025 and thinking about the NLRB and what that's going to look like under the Trump administration. The point I think you're getting at is that, with this previous administration with Biden, his policies had a lot of teeth in them, kind of forcing corporations to adhere to these new policies. And then going forward, there's probably be a lot more relaxed, right? So, but now we have, I guess, from a corporate perspective, you can either just be like, hey, I'm going to just adhere to regulatory policies and not do anything extra. But if you were a corporation and saying, hey, I am going to be really responsible in managing my human capital, what sort of advice would you give them to corporations that kind of would want to lean into that?
I think I would just remind companies that being good for workers and advertising as being good for workers is not the same thing as being political. And, between like the Me Too movement, between, George Floyd, Summer, we have seen just these incredible waves and crashes of what companies want to be ahead of in how they brand themselves, what kind of employer and business they are, trying to stay on the right side of whatever issue is kind of the center of the day. And I think what I would tell companies is that is, in some ways so separate, that has no trend. That isn't about news coverage or media or Supreme Court cases or whoever is president. There is a model for high pay, low retention, better benefits to attract the best people, to retain the best people, to have, the best people in your shop. I think for some employers, they kind of they can conflate these two when it's not a political question. Being good for workers is being good for the economy, and it's always been, when you're a labor economist, you kind of step back and you look at trends, and I don't have a first person perspective on this, and so I'm trying not to be kind of disrespectful or dismissive, but the antagonism between labor and management on some level makes almost no sense to me. The room for collaboration is incredible. I mean, there's been surveys of workers who say that more than anything else, what they want at work is to feel like their voice matters in their job, in their workload, in their responsibilities, to feel like someone listens to them and the opinions that they have based on their experience working at the company. And those numbers have been cratering. Most people feel completely ignored. And it doesn't matter what good idea they have, their companies don't care. So much more that comes from collaboration with your workforce and seeing them truly as partners could be a very powerful and lucrative part of a business model if you chose to see it that way.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It kind of reminds me a little bit how ESG was taken more like stakeholder capitalism, right? Am I being a good corporate citizen? Am I caring about the environment? Am I caring about my human capital? Is my governance in terms of board of directors skilled enough to guide me through the next 5, 10, 15 years? And so you take this like good thing, and then it kind of got flipped on its head and politicized as no, 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 no. Like, no, we are like anti-woke or anti-ESG, all of those things. It's just, your point is just reminding me how like these very fine points on this thing is good for everybody, including corporations, including your employees. And then it just kind of gets lost. The message gets entirely lost when it gets politicized. And then we're seeing a lot of corporations just kind of back away from that. Like, right, we don't want to be involved in politics. We don't want to be seen as one side or the other side, which is fair. But coming back to your point is like, we have to really strip that away and just look at what is good. You don't want to be spending intensive costs towards hiring, onboarding, just to lose them later because you have these policies that kind of like don't support your employees. So I think that was a very interesting point.
Yeah, I guess maybe another way of saying what I'm circling around is you get to choose your workforce. It's not as if it's random. You pick the type of people that you want, and the way that you pick them is in how you pay them and how you treat them. And that's not about being woke. That's just how you value the people on the front line of your company. I wrote a column, just last week about work requirements. And there's this, political push to add work requirements and more work requirements to public programs, even though the evidence, is overwhelmingly clear. It just pushes people off of public programs. It doesn't increase the amount they're working because so many people in public programs are already working. And they're working in jobs that have really high turnover because they have unstable shift scheduling. And they don't pay that well, and they don't have paid sick days, and they don't have paid holidays, and they don't have paid time off. And so you just churn through the bottom of this labor market at taxpayer expense. And the policy answer is like, well, just don't let the taxpayers expense it, but it doesn't get to the root of the problem, which is how low-wage workers are treated. These are big policy questions for the labor market that employers and corporations are absolutely a part of. And some of them choose to be leaders and some of them choose to be laggards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then focusing in on the leaders and thinking about 2025, just trying to tie this back to maybe some more tangible advice here. So leaning into 2025, how would you recommend corporations think about risks? And then on the flip side, what would advice you would give to like lean into opportunities here?
Can I tell a story?
Absolutely.
A very stable finding in labor economics is the presence of discrimination in audit studies. Audit studies is a term that economists use for randomized resume experiments. So I create 2 resumes, they are absolutely identical. I change the name at the top. One of the most famous studies in economics that did this are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? So you have it's character for character identical. You just change the name at the top to sound more black or more white. You send it out and you look at the callback rates. Now these are resumes that are, you don't see the person. This person they've all been invented, and yet the callback rates for the white name over the black name, it's going to be 20 to 40% higher on a piece of paper. And the only thing that was different was that it was Emily versus Lakeisha. That should indicate to you a gross loss of opportunity for employers who can figure out how to get past 200 years of discrimination in our country that gets pushed into like so many parts of our labor market latently that we don't see. If you can get past that, that means that there is a worker who is undervalued that you get to hire. What I think that's what a lot of DEI initiatives were trying to do, but either failed or it wasn't palatable in how they did it. But the idea is absolutely correct. But it's, how do you solve a problem that you can't really see when you only see the results? You don't see the mechanisms at work. The companies that can figure that out, they get to take advantage of that undervalued labor. So this is about bottom line. Maybe there's a woke blowback against DEI, but the idea is sound.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of missing piece here. We have the facts, we have the research pointing towards these indicators that, like, yes, for example, more diverse boards do help corporations, but the gap still, I think, is in either resistance to status quo, and then thinking about, I think a lot of time these initiatives, when you try to change status quo, is automatically assumed as at a cost. Yes, it's an investment, but you're going to get return on that investment. And we've done several research studies on, board diversity, ethnic diversity. But I'm looking at this older research article that S&P published. And just the headline here, it says we have an opportunity to add 5 to 10% to nominal GDP by attracting just more women into the workforce. So there's, again, to your point, there's all of these stats that say, yes, this is a good thing. It's good, to treat your employers and give them, benefits. Yes, it's an investment, but that investment will have payoffs down the line here.
Yes, absolutely. But I think it's also worth stopping and thinking about what are the things that companies truly can't do. I mean, they can't do everything. They can't fix all parts of the economy, and they can make the difference on hiring, on seeing people who are undervalued by the labor market and taking a market advantage of that problem, that have so many issues related to kind of human worth and discrimination, things like that. But from the cold-hearted view of an employer, like, that's an opportunity. I realize that sounds bad on some level of like, hey, what's discrimination against Black people if you can make money off of it? But at the same time, like, I think employers are in the best position to solve that problem. There are certain problems employers are not in a good position to solve. So the hiring and pay of Black workers, you can be a leader. Childcare, there's just not that much you can do because it is so expensive. And part of me wishes that you heard more from companies to, federal leaders to say, this is your job. We cannot provide, the childcare market is so broken. It can cost an individual person, $20,000 to $30,000 a year to get their kid in care. That an employer can't take that on, right? That is a market failure large enough and deep enough and affecting enough people. That is a public policy problem. And so I think there are room for companies to fix certain things because they're poised to do it. They can see opportunity and they can see like a role for themselves. Childcare is so expensive. It would be only a fraction of companies that would be able to do something meaningful about it. But it could be, the majority of companies that could call their congressman and say, you need to fix childcare. Like, it's hurting my ability to retain workers that, they want pay high enough to cover childcare. They need childcare benefits. Their childcare drops out and I lose them anyway. There are some things that employers, the biggest job that they can have is to communicate to policymakers, this one's on you. And certainly for childcare, that one's on policymakers. I honestly feel the same way about paid family leave. I think that wouldn't be as obvious to some people, but yeah, paid family leave should come from the federal government. It's a massive expense, especially for businesses that are smaller. It shouldn't come from your bottom line. That should come from the taxpayers because it's an investment in economy-wide stability in the next generation. So I think it's worth saying, like, there are things that a company can solve, but there are lots of things that a company can't solve. And being able to see the difference there is big.
That's a great point. I like that. Trying to ring fence and think about what, as a corporation, what you can do and what you have the power to do and power to change, but also leaning into if it's out of your control and really has to be done through policy, then exercising that muscle and using your voice, right, to enforce that and say, hey, I have this problem, just like any other constituent.
Whenever the US is at an election year, it always merits a degree of introspection that the odd years don't get. Of, who are we? Where are we going? What is this economy? What do we want? And what I would stress is that the future holds so many more possibilities than the past. And, it's not just nostalgia. There feels like there's this pull to try and recreate the economy of yesteryear, to pursue policy that chases this ghost of the economy of 1950 or the economy of 1980 or the industrial composition of 1980. And it's not possible to move this $20 trillion economy backwards. The only way is forward. And that is a forward that you either embrace or it's a forward that you fight. The future is built by the people who are trying to embrace it, not trying to fight it. And that goes for companies too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Kathryn. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you, audience, so much for listening. And again, special thanks to my guest this month, Kathryn Edwards. We'll be back in the new year. And until then, subscribe and maybe catch up on some past episodes from this year. We talked about AI, investor activism, and investor engagement, amongst other things. And again, thank you for listening and have a great day.